The living room smelled of vanilla candles and furniture polish, too sweet and too sharp at the same time. Daniel's house in Newark had never felt so small. 14 of us crammed into every chair and corner, cousins balanced on folding seats, uncles perched on the arms of sofas, aunts whispering behind their hands. The air was heavy with the kind of tension that makes you sit straighter even when you want to sink into the cushions. I took the chair near the window, the one that always caught the winter draft. No one else ever wanted that spot, so it had become mine, a place where I could breathe, while everyone else pressed closer together. The old wall clock ticked louder than usual, each second falling hard in the silence. My son Daniel sat across the room, his shoulders hunched, his fingers laced so tightly in his lap that his knuckles showed white. He kept his eyes down, never lifting them to me. My daughter Sarah sat near the doorway, her hair falling like a curtain, as she bent over her phone, pretending to be busy. They were both present, but absent, their silence like a wall between us. Melissa stood. She had chosen her dress carefully, a dark green that shimmered under the lights, cut perfectly to flatter her figure. She moved with purpose, every gesture deliberate. She carried a folder filled with papers and charts, the corners sharp against her manicured fingers. She smiled as if she were about to deliver good news, but her eyes held no warmth. "Robert, beginning next month, your rent for the third-floor apartment will increase from $2,500 to $3,800. The words dropped into the room and spread like smoke. I saw heads turn, shoulders stiffen, lips purse. A cousin coughed into his hand. Aunt Patricia tilted her head and murmured something about the rising cost of everything these days. Uncle Ted cleared his throat in the way he always did when he wanted to seem knowledgeable but had nothing useful to add. Melissa opened her folder and lifted a glossy page with colored bars and numbers. Comparable units in Newark are going for at least $4,000, some closer to $4,500. You have been paying far below market. That means I have been carrying the difference, nearly $90,000 over the past 5 years. I cannot continue this." She spoke with the cadence of a lawyer addressing a jury, each sentence neat, polished, undeniable on its surface. I had paid every month. I had never asked for a delay, never once failed to meet the first of the month. When pipes leaked, I fixed them. When the plaster cracked, I patched it. But no one in that room cared about those quiet truths. Melissa set the page back in her folder and produced a form, clipped neatly, sliding it across the coffee table. She placed a pen beside it, silver under the lamplight. "You can sign tonight," she said, her voice smooth. "It will make things easier for everyone." Daniel shifted in his chair, the faintest movement, but he did not look up. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the carpet. Sarah drew her hands into her lap and stared at the floor. Neither spoke. Neither looked at me. Their silence pressed harder than any insult, harder than the weight of Melissa's words. A few of the relatives nodded as if Melissa had done something noble. I saw the smirks, the satisfied expressions of people who enjoyed watching someone else humbled. My chest ached, but my face stayed still. The room waited. The pen glinted in the light like a knife, its purpose clear. I thought of the years of checks written in neat handwriting, delivered on time, unremarkable because they were reliable. I thought of the nights when the heat faltered, and I kept myself warm with extra blankets rather than call and complain. I thought of Sarah as a little girl, curled in my lap while I read to her by the same window where I now sat alone. None of that mattered in this room. Melissa folded her arms lightly, her smile polite, her stance firm. The form lay between us, the price of silence. Everyone leaned forward, waiting for me to pick up the pen. The old clock ticked louder each second, echoing the question none of them would ask aloud. Would I sign away my dignity tonight? or would I find my voice? The house seemed to breathe with their expectation. I sat motionless, the paper untouched, my children silent, and the weight of it heavier than anything Melissa had said. The silence itself was the judgment, and I was left to decide whether to accept it. I chose stillness over surrender. In 2010, I was a site engineer with a permanent dust of concrete on my boots and a lunchbox that smelled faintly of coffee no matter what I packed. When I said my job built houses, she said her job built foundations, and then she would tap the budget columns she had drawn by hand and tell me we were getting closer. On Saturdays, we drove past brick walk-ups in the Ironbound and old two families on Bloomfield Avenue, and we kept a notebook of addresses that looked tired but not hopeless. In late 2013, we met a landlord named Mr. Rossi, who was tired in the way people are when they have worked too long for too little thanks. The building had good bones, I said. She nodded eyes on the numbers in her notebook and said, good bones can carry a lot if the math holds. Mortgage scenarios, insurance quotes, tax history, rent rolls scribbled with ranges. She called a real estate attorney, a friend of a teacher friend, and set an appointment. I remember the day she practiced saying the name of a company out loud, a phrase that sounded too big for our small kitchen. Liberty Properties. The first time we sat in the attorney's office, I understood only half of what was said. Angela understood all of it. She asked about liability and title and what happens if the teacher in her turning questions into a plan. I watched her look more certain with each answer. She pressed her lips together in that way she had when a thing clicked into place. The deal did not happen overnight. We patched our old car twice. I took extra shifts consulting on a hospital renovation in Harrison. We saved and we hunted, and we waited. And in early 2016, Mr. Rossi called. He was ready to be done. The keys were heavy when they hit Angela's palm. I said her eyes were better for numbers. We both smiled. We were not rich. We were owners. I changed pressure valves and resealed a roof hatch that always rattled in a nor'easter. We painted hallways a warm color that made even winter evenings look kinder. When a young couple had a baby, Angela left a basket at their door with tiny socks and a note that said, "Congratulations," in her careful teacher script. In early 2017, Angela's doctor said a lump, then a biopsy, then a plan, a word I disliked, attached to a thing I feared. I tried to face it by doing. I added insulation to a place in the attic where a draft had always snuck in. They never could. Spring turned to summer and back to fall, and our kitchen still smelled like coffee and lists. One night, the attorney stopped by our house with a folder and spoke in a soft voice about signatures and beneficiaries. Angela made sure my name was where it needed to be. I nodded as if I understood all of it. I did not fully. I only understood that I was watching the person who always knew how to steady the ground beneath us, make arrangements to steady it for me when she could not stand on it anymore. It was a gray afternoon in March when she took my hand and pressed a brown envelope into it. The paper was smooth from being handled and heavy with something more than paper. She said, "If a day comes when you are being pushed around, use this. Necessary, simple, binding." I asked what is in it. She said enough. I asked when should I open it. She said, "You will know." Then she closed her eyes and rested, and I sat with the envelope in my lap and realized that for the first time in a long time, I did not know what to do with my hands. After the service in April, after the casseroles and the hugs that got too tight from people who do not know what to say, when words are useless, I put the envelope in the top drawer of our bedroom dresser under a stack of sweaters I never wore. I told myself I would look at it when my head was clearer. I told myself I would bring it to the attorney next week. I went to the building, met the boiler tech, paid the property tax bill, and told tenants that the schedule for trash pickup had changed. Daniel visited less that year. He had work that stretched late and an engagement to plan. Sarah finished a nursing program and took night shifts that swallowed weekends. The house grew quiet, the kind of quiet that used to feel like rest when Angela filled it, the kind of quiet that felt like echo when I was alone in it. I learned to shop for one to cook enough, and not too much to put a single plate in the dishwasher and still press start. Autopay was set. Vendors knew who to call. Tenants sent checks to the address Angela had used. I kept the building running and told myself that was enough. The envelope slept under the sweaters. Daniel came by late on Christmas Eve. He stood with his coat in his hands and told me he and Melissa were setting a date. I said that was good. He asked if I needed anything. I said no and meant yes, but did not know how to name the yes. Inspectors, renewals, repainting sidewalks where salt had chewed the edges. I kept pressing start on autopay. The envelope kept its place under the sweaters. The dresser drawer slid shut with the same soft click it had always made. In 2019, Daniel married Melissa in a rented hall in Montclair with exposed brick and Edison bulbs that made everyone look both warmer and more tired. Later that year, Melissa began to insert herself into building matters on the surface as a helper. I said fine. It sounded organized. Then came the suggestions about market rates. Then came the first time she said that my rent was below what made sense. She said it in a tone that tried to be kind and landed somewhere colder. I did not open the drawer. I did not touch the envelope. I told myself I could handle a conversation. I told myself that I had seen worse friction on job sites. I kept living in that space of almost and not yet. I kept paying. I kept fixing small things with my own hands. The envelope waited too patient as a teacher with a stubborn student. By the time winter came and Daniel's living room filled with our family, and that pen glinted under the lamplight, I had almost forgotten the weight of the paper Angela had placed in my palm. Almost, but not enough to erase the memory of her steady eyes. If a day comes, she had said, and my hand had learned the shape of that day the moment Melissa pushed the form toward me. I felt the soft drag of the dresser drawer in my mind. I felt the weight of sweaters. I felt the edge of the envelope against my skin. And I understood finally that doing and knowing are not the same, and that sometimes a quiet, prepared years ago is the only sound that matters when every other voice in the room has gone still. The wedding in Montclair should have been a day of joy. But for me, it was the first crack that showed how quickly family could shift when new voices grew louder. The hall was strung with Edison bulbs and garlands of white roses. Melissa glided from table to table like a hostess already trained for politics. Her parents beamed. Daniel followed her like a shadow, shaking hands, smiling, letting her lead every conversation. I sat at a table with cousins and uncles, people who once asked me for advice on roofs and mortgages, and now they whispered about Melissa's talent for organization, as if she had single-handedly built the walls around us. When the speeches began, her maid of honor praised her ambition and her eye for detail. Daniel's best man made jokes about late nights at the office and how lucky he was to have a wife who could manage everything. Then Melissa stood with the microphone, her voice steady, her eyes shining. She thanked everyone for being part of their new chapter and spoke about the building in Newark as if it were her accomplishment. She told the room how she had stepped in to help manage it, how she had organized the tenants' streamlined communication and made sure the property was cared for. Applause rose. I sat still, my hands pressed flat against my thighs. Liberty Properties had been born in the quiet of my kitchen with Angela's handwriting, but no one in that hall remembered that. They remembered Melissa's polished words. Aunt Patricia leaned toward me, perfume heavy, and said, Melissa has really taken a load off your shoulders, hasn't she? I nodded once and forced a smile. Across the table, Uncle Ted added that it must be nice to have someone responsible in the family to handle things. The words slid in deeper than they probably meant, but the sting was real. I lifted my glass and drank without answering. I looked for Sarah in the crowd. She stood near the bar with her nursing friends laughing softly, her eyes anywhere but on me. After the honeymoon, Melissa's presence grew larger. She sent group emails to tenants using a Liberty Properties address she had created herself. She answered maintenance questions without consulting me and called it efficiency. When relatives gathered for Thanksgiving that year, she explained to the family how she had saved money by renegotiating the waste removal contract. She presented it as though she were CEO of a company, and I was a retired employee watching from the sidelines. My name never came up. The cousins clapped. Daniel smiled weakly and carved the turkey. I tried once to remind him quietly that I was still the owner, that the paperwork was in my name, that Liberty Properties was Angela's and mine. He looked tired and said, "Melissa is only trying to help. She is good at this. Let her." The way he said "let her" sounded less like permission and more like surrender. I swallowed my protest and let the silence grow between us. It was easier than fighting at the table where everyone else believed her version of events. By 2020, family gatherings had shifted tone. Conversations that once started with "how is work" now began with Melissa saying how she had updated the tenant ledger or how she was handling late payments during the pandemic. The aunts and uncles praised her resilience, her leadership, her foresight. Some even said Daniel was lucky to have found a woman who could keep the family business alive. My presence shrank to the corner of the room, the drafty chair by the window, the place where eyes skipped past me. I became the man who still lived upstairs, tolerated because of history, not respected for what I had built. Sarah called less. When she did, the conversations were short. She was tired from long shifts, she said. She was busy, she said. But beneath her excuses was something heavier. The unease of a daughter who no longer wanted to stand in the crossfire between her father and her brother's wife. When I asked if she would come by for dinner, she hesitated. "Maybe next week," she said. And then the next week never came. Silence became her answer, too. One evening in early 2021, Melissa invited several relatives to the building for a tour. She led them through the hallways I had painted, the boiler. I had repaired the apartments Angela and I had once walked together, dreaming of what they could be. Melissa spoke with pride as if she were unveiling her own work. She pointed out improvements she had scheduled, not ones she had paid for or planned, but ones she had simply mentioned aloud. The relatives nodded and praised her initiative. I followed at the back of the group, hands in my pockets, the weight of the envelope in my dresser, heavy in my thoughts. When the tour ended, Melissa turned to me with a smile that carried steel underneath. "You should be grateful," she said softly enough, "that only I heard grateful you still have a place here." The words landed harder than the rent increase she would later demand. Grateful, as if my own roof were a favor, as if decades of work and sweat were erased by her assumption of control. I wanted to speak to remind her of the signatures on the deeds of Angela's planning of the company name that bore no trace of her. But Daniel's eyes were on me, pleading silently for peace. Sarah had already slipped away before dessert. The others waited for me to nod and accept, and so I said nothing. I carried the sentence with me like a stone in my chest, a reminder that my children's silence hurt worse than any word Melissa could throw. That night in my apartment, I sat in the chair Angela once used to grade papers. The brown envelope rested in the top drawer only a few feet away. My hand hovered on the knob but did not open it. Not yet. The clock ticked steady. Outside the window, the city lights blinked as if nothing had changed. But inside me, a fracture deepened, a crack in the family I had believed was unshakable. It was not the insult itself that broke me. It was the way no one else saw it as an insult at all. The fracture was quiet, invisible to those who only saw Melissa's shine. But I felt it each time Daniel lowered his eyes, each time Sarah changed the subject. Each time relatives praised her as if my existence were an afterthought. The building stood solid in brick and steel, but within its walls the foundation of family had shifted. And I knew one day, sooner than anyone expected, the silence would give way to something louder. Her voice came steady and sure as she told the room that the market had moved, that comparable units in Newark now commanded $4,000 and more, that for 5 years I had paid $2,500, and that by her calculation she had absorbed almost $90,000. She told the room that Melissa was a blessing to the family. Daniel stayed still. He did not look at me. I waited for even a small flicker that said he remembered who had poured concrete in the rain and who had scraped old paint from stair rails until his knuckles cracked. She spoke about comps and trends and responsible stewardship. She spoke about how difficult it had been to maintain fairness when sentiment clouded judgment, and by sentiment she meant me. When she finished, she smiled without softness and laid a single sheet on the coffee table. She said that for the sake of clarity and to align expectations, the rent for the third-floor apartment would be set at $3,800 beginning next month. She said that this reflected current market realities and a reasonable adjustment period had already been granted. I heard a cousin murmur that this was overdue. Aunt Patricia said that hard decisions were the mark of leadership. Uncle Ted grunted his agreement as if he had personally lifted something heavy. I looked at the page without touching it. The words were simple enough: new amount, effective date, signature line. A number is only a shape until you attach it to a choice. It was the meaning pressed into that shape by my family, the performance of righteousness, the parade of approval for a woman who had stepped into a story she did not write and started narrating from the middle as if the opening chapters were an inconvenience. Melissa shifted her stance so that the hem of her dress brushed the edge of the coffee table. She said she had kept the rent low out of respect for family, but that the time had come to be realistic. She said everyone needed to contribute according to their means. She did not say what I had contributed for decades, because that would have broken the rhythm of her argument. He held his silence like a piece of glass that might cut the moment he loosened his grip. I thought of him as a boy, sick with fever, head on Angela's lap, while I sat on the edge of the bed and counted breaths until dawn. I thought of Sarah asleep on my chest, in a room not much bigger than the pantry in this house, her breath sweet with milk, my shirt damp where she drooled. The memory lifted and fell, replaced by the present, by the neat pen waiting for my compliance. Melissa began to list what she called her efforts. She mentioned renegotiated contracts, improved communication protocols, a new system for tracking maintenance requests. She told Aunt Patricia and Uncle Ted and the cousins that she had stepped in because chaos cannot run a building. She did not glance at me when she said chaos. The word floated and settled where she wanted it to. Sarah moved to the kitchen archway and poured water into a glass with unnecessary care. I studied the faces, each of them arranged into an expression that looks modern and respectable in family photos. I wondered how many of them knew what a boiler sounds like when it is about to fail, or how to coax a 90-year-old window back into its track without cracking the sash. I wondered how many had ever climbed a ladder in winter to chip ice from a gutter so a thaw would not pour into a bedroom. A cousin asked what would happen if I refused. Melissa did not miss a beat. She said that was not the spirit in which this conversation was happening, but that there were applicants ready to lease at market rate should it become necessary. Uncle Ted made a small, approving noise that sounded to me like a lock sliding into place. I breathed in slowly and let the air out through my nose. The clock on the wall ticked toward a moment when the room expected a performance from me. Gratitude or apology, or an elderly man's capitulation dressed as reason. My hands remained where they lay, palms against my thighs, fingers relaxed. That stillness felt like the one honest thing left to me in that room, a refusal to add my motion to their choreography. Melissa straightened the page, even though it did not need straightening. She said it again, that it would be easier to finalize this tonight. She explained that sometimes we all have to do difficult things. She smiled in my direction, the expression you give a child who will not swallow medicine. Daniel's hands tightened until the knuckles went pale. Sarah leaned one shoulder against the doorway and watched me as if she were measuring the distance between who I had been and who I might choose to be right now. I lifted my eyes to the faces arranged around the room and found nothing there for me to use. No small opening where a real conversation might slide in and take root. Only the expectation of my signature and the relief it would give them, not because it solved anything worth solving, but because it made the story simpler. In that story, Melissa was the capable one the family rallied around her, and the old man who kept living in a corner of his own building finally stepped into line. My chest ached, though not from fear. It ached the way a muscle aches when you hold a weight away from your body longer than anyone believes you can. The quiet I chose was not the quiet they wanted. Mine was the kind that gathers itself like weather. I folded my hands together, not as a sign of surrender, but so I would not reach for the pen out of habit. Aunt Patricia said that families stay strong when everyone accepts their role. Uncle Ted seconded it with a nod that seemed to close a door. Melissa watched me, her patience taut as a string. Daniel stared at the carpet. Sarah pressed her lips together and did not move. The clock marked another second. The candle burned lower. The paper lay waiting between us, a small island of white, in a sea of approval that did not include me. I drew a breath that went all the way down and let it out slow. The room did not speak, it only watched. And I sat there while their judgment settled like dust, while the pen shone like a blade, and while the last of my hesitation burned itself out quietly where no one could see. I let my hands rest where they were, and the room waited for me to fold. One line on the screen in Mr. Carter's name. On my way, documents ready. I set the phone face down on my knee and felt something lock into place, not rage, not defiance for its own sake, but a decision that sounded like a clean click inside my chest. The pen still lay like a bright blade between us, which meant I would have to stand anyway. A memory rose as plainly as if the lamp beside me had lit it from within. Angela in our kitchen, the kettle humming the early spring light, slanting across a legal pad filled with her neat columns. She looked up at me and spoke without drama. When they go quiet on what is right, you stand tall. I had carried that line for years, like a tool I never quite needed to take out of the box. Now I felt it in my palm. Melissa began again, filling the silence with the smoothness of someone who believes the argument is settled. She said this was the most reasonable path. She said families had to be honest about resources. She said the market dictated terms. I thought of the brown envelope in the dresser. I thought of keys heavy in Angela's hand the day we became owners. I thought of the hours I had spent in basements and stairwells and on rooftops making sure strangers had heat and light and safety, because that was the bargain we had made with the building when we took it in. I lifted my eyes to Daniel. He still would not look up. The ache that had been sitting inside my ribs shifted, and became something steadier. I pulled air in through my nose and let it out slow enough to measure the second it took the clock to catch up. Then I did the smallest thing, the only thing needed to move the weight of the room. I uncrossed my hands, placed my left palm on the table's edge, and pushed the contract back toward the center by less than an inch. "No," I said. The word came out quiet like a plumb line, straight and true. Melissa blinked first. The relatives stopped their nodding in mid-arc faces, hanging for a heartbeat, before settling into confusion. Aunt Patricia's mouth opened before her thoughts formed. Uncle Ted made a soft sound that could have been a question or a warning. Sarah straightened in the doorway, her eyes on me for the first time that night. "No," I said again, steady now. "I will not sign." Melissa found her next line. She said she understood this was difficult. She said change often felt unfair at first. She suggested we think of this as a necessary correction. I did not reach for it. I did not raise my voice. I simply repeated what Angela would have called the sentence you can put your name under. I will not sign. Aunt Patricia reclaimed her breath and tried for a softer approach. She said surely there was a compromise that would keep the peace. A cousin muttered that everyone had to do their part. I let them fall. She shifted to numbers again. She spoke about the 90,000 she said she had absorbed. She mentioned future capital improvements that could not be deferred. She said no one wanted to make this harder than necessary. I nodded once, not in agreement, but to mark that I had heard the performance. Then I set both hands on my knees and leaned forward just enough to make sure my voice would carry without effort. I have paid every month. I have kept my agreements and my home. I am not a problem to be managed. I will not sign. Daniel's head rose a fraction, the first movement toward the space where a son might speak for his father. His lips parted, closed, and parted again. He said Dad in a tone that was careful and small. He said, Melissa is trying to be fair. I looked at him and held his gaze until he dropped it. He said nothing else. Sarah took a step into the room, the heel of her shoe scuffing lightly against the wood. Her eyes moved between Melissa and me, measuring ready to flinch if the sound of the room cracked. She did not speak either, but the shape of her mouth changed, the hard line softening into something like surprise. Melissa felt the window of control narrowing and pressed forward. She said, if we could not agree, other options existed. She said applicants were ready. She said timelines did not stretch indefinitely. I did not touch it. Instead, I lifted my phone from my knee and looked down as if checking the time. The message from Mr. Carter waited like a lifeline that did not need tugging yet. On my way, documents ready. I slid the phone back into my pocket and set my shoulders the way I would on a scaffold when the wind came up. You are asking me to buy your version of fairness, I said, and to pay for it with my name. I will not. The clock ticked on with an indifference I found reassuring. Melissa tried one more angle. She said families should not have to resort to formalities. She said we should handle this like adults and not make a scene. Adults, in my experience, sign what they understand and refuse what they do not believe in. I did not say that. I said nothing at all. Daniel finally looked at me fully. For a second, I saw the boy in his face, the one who used to watch me fix a trap under a sink and ask why copper bends like that. He seemed to be searching for something in me that he could use as a step. He found only the thing I had brought to this room on purpose. Sarah moved closer to the coffee table until she stood just behind Melissa's shoulder. She glanced down at the contract, then up at me again, a question forming that she was not ready to ask. For the first time, I felt the room hesitate. Melissa drew in a breath and set her palm flat on the paper, as if to claim it back from the moment. She began to say that the offer would stand until the end of the evening, that after that she could not guarantee anything. The doorbell rang. Every head turned a fraction. The sound was small and ordinary. It landed like a change in weather. I kept my eyes on the contract for one beat longer, then lifted them to Melissa. She waited poised between annoyance and control. I rose slowly, the draft from the window cool on my shoulder, and straightened my jacket. No one spoke. I walked past Daniel, past Sarah, past the coffee table with its bright blade of a pen, and crossed the room toward the hall. The quiet of my steps, the only sound the room could count. I reached the hallway, and the bell rang again, a neat chime that did not belong to the tension behind me. A family photo in a brass frame leaned there at Daniel at 8, with a missing front tooth and a baseball cap too big for his head. In the glass I could see the room behind me, faces turned, the pen a bright shard O. If you refuse to sign, we will issue a 30-day notice at the end of this week. Your lease term has lapsed, and it is irresponsible to keep the building under market. There are applicants ready to step in. Aunt Patricia said it sounded reasonable. Uncle Ted added that no one was getting any younger. I kept my palm on the console and breathed the way Angela had taught her students, when the room stirred too much, in through the nose, out slow enough to feel the breath cool the back of the throat. "Dad," he said barely above a whisper. "Maybe we can talk in the kitchen and figure out a plan." Melissa did not wait for a plan. She said the 3 applicants included 2 associates from a firm downtown and a medical resident from St. Michael's. They had solid credit and were willing to pay $4,000 or more. She said we would be foolish to leave money on the table. She added that she had printed their pre-approval letters if anyone wanted to see. Sarah moved a few steps closer to the hall. "We should slow down." Melissa answered that time is money and delay is a cost. I let my fingers find the seam in the console's wood where the varnish dipped slightly. Instead, there was the quiet sound of a shoe scuff on the porch, and then a patient knock, 2 soft taps. I could feel the room deciding whether to tell me to leave the door or to rush it, but no one spoke. I kept my back to them and looked at the brass frame until my pulse fell into a rhythm I recognized. Melissa's voice sharpened, not loud, just honed. "If you stay past the end of next month without a signed agreement, we will treat it as a holdover and adjust the rate accordingly. I have consulted an attorney. I will proceed." The point of a threat is not its accuracy, but its usefulness. A cousin tried to laugh and failed. Aunt Patricia began a sentence and let it die. Uncle Ted cleared his throat and suggested that a smaller rear unit might suit me and cost less. Sarah whispered that it is his home. I turned enough to see them from the side. Melissa was composed, the pen placed exactly where she wanted it. Daniel stared at a spot on the rug, like a man trying to solve a problem by looking at something that has no numbers. Her face held worry, and something else I could not name in that moment. I said I heard you, and the sound of my own voice steadied me again. I kept it quiet. I kept it even. I did not add anything. There was nothing to add. I had already said no. Melissa stepped closer, just short of my shoulder. She said it would be better for everyone if I returned to the table and signed. She said family matters should not involve outsiders. She said creating a scene would make things ugly and unnecessary. I looked at the hallway wall where a thin scratch ran the height of the baseboard, a mark left of the day we moved in a new couch for Daniel, and it caught on the corner. I had told him we would fix it later. We never did. The knock came again, the same 2 taps, patient and firm. I felt my phone vibrate once in my pocket, a soft buzz against my hip, then stillness. Enough was already moving. Daniel stood. He said "Dad" again, a little louder. Melissa cut across him with a smile that did not change her eyes. She said, "We are doing this kindly and within the law." She said I had been given every consideration. She said the best thing would be to sign now and avoid unpleasantness. She kept saying now, as if this were an emergency she was resolving for me. I let my hand fall from the console and folded both hands loosely in front of me. My shoulders were loose. My jaw was not. I turned the rest of the way toward them. The room quieted in that odd way rooms do when they sense a change they cannot name. I looked at each face and found a different version of the same vacancy. Approval for the story they had accepted. Discomfort that I was not playing my assigned part. Sarah spoke to the room, not to me. Maybe we should let him think. Maybe we should not force a signature tonight. The sentence sounded like she was asking permission to feel. No one granted it. No one refused it. It just hung there honest and small. Melissa answered by shifting to a new angle. She said perhaps a move would be better for me anyway. She named a senior building near Branch Brook Park. She said it was modern and quiet. She said it would be closer to the hospital if I ever needed it. She said it as if she were doing me a kindness. I thought of Angela laughing at a joke in a line at the grocery store, and the sound of her laugh was so clear that for a second it drowned out the words. I told Melissa I had heard all the options. I told her I would not sign. I told her I would not leave my home because someone else found a use for it. I kept my voice even because a steady voice changes more minds than a loud one. It did not change hers. She said, "Then we will proceed." She said the notice would be prepared by Friday. She said she would email a copy and hand-deliver another. She said I should begin packing. The certainty in her tone would have frightened me once. Tonight, it sounded like a person mistaking a map for the ground. I could hear the refrigerator motor in the kitchen and the soft movement of air through the vents. Ordinary sounds everywhere like a reminder that the world still worked. I let them fill the space between Melissa's last sentence and mine. I said, "I am done with this conversation." It was not dramatic. It was not a performance. It was the end of a line I had walked for longer than I cared to admit. Aunt Patricia started to protest. Uncle Ted lifted a hand and lowered it again. Daniel took a breath that did not turn into words. Sarah's eyes shone, but she did not cry. Melissa lifted her chin and said she was sorry it had come to this. She did not sound sorry. I turned back to the door. The knob felt cool under my palm, the metal smooth from 100 hands before mine. I stood there for a moment and let the quiet gather itself the way you do before stepping out into weather. You can feel through the glass, but cannot yet measure. The house held its breath with me. Then I pressed my fingers closer around the knob and waited for the next sound to tell me what to do. He said good evening, asked if he might come in, and said his name was Mr. Carter. I stepped aside. Melissa was already turning toward us, chin lifted, smile set. Then he turned to me as if to confirm what we both already knew we would do next. "May I?" he said, and I gestured to the coffee table. Her voice was bright and composed. She said she managed the building and that any property matters should go through her. She said we were in the middle of a private family discussion and that perhaps he could reschedule. Mr. Carter listened until she finished and then answered in a voice that respected the room without surrendering to it. He said he was counsel for Liberty Properties, LLC, and that he was here by request of the owner. Daniel went still in a way I had not seen since he was a child, caught between truth and fear. Melissa kept her smile, but it trembled at the edges. She said there must be a misunderstanding. She said she had been overseeing operations for years and that no one had informed her of any change of title. She said we could straighten this out without drama. Mr. Carter did not raise his voice. He said again that ownership had been in my name through Liberty Properties since 2017. Aunt Patricia tried to speak and failed to find a sentence. Uncle Ted managed what that sounded more like a wheeze. Daniel's mouth opened, closed, opened. Sarah whispered, "Oh," and went quiet. Melissa shifted from disbelief to strategy. She asked when this supposed transfer had occurred. She asked why she had not been consulted. She asked whether this gentleman realized she had been shouldering responsibilities pro bono for the sake of family. Mr. Carter remained courteous. He said records showed a purchase and formation in early 2016 with closing and filings in 2017, that notices had been issued to tenants at that time under the Liberty Properties address, and that management had been handled according to those records since. The room shifted again. A cousin picked up one of the tax receipts and read the date aloud, then flushed and set it down as if it had burned. I felt a strange calm. It was not triumph. It was not even relief. Melissa recovered enough to attempt a new angle. She said even if that were accurate, the unit in question was a family unit and should be treated differently. She said some arrangements are customary. She said we could find a compromise that respected all parties. Mr. Carter did not give her that role. He looked at the binder, turned one more tab, and set down a brief memo sheet. He said for clarity, all apartments within the property are included under the Liberty Properties ownership. This includes the apartment occupied by Daniel Miller and Melissa Miller. The effect was immediate. Aunt Patricia sat back and put a hand to her chest. Uncle Ted let his arms drop and stared at the paper as if it contained a riddle he had no tools to solve. Daniel flinched the way a person does when a fact hits the skin. Melissa did not move. She went still in the strange way a person goes still when the shape of the room has shifted and they cannot feel the edges yet. Daniel spoke my name and then stopped. He looked from me to the binder to Melissa and back again. He asked Mr. Carter if he was saying their lease was with Liberty Properties. Mr. Carter said yes. He said their tenancy had been formal and current under that entity for years. He said payments were recorded accordingly. The words were simple. The reality behind them was not. Melissa found her voice and tried to step around the facts. She said this was unnecessary, that the spirit of the arrangement should matter more than the letter. She said family understands what is implied, even when paperwork is complicated. She said she had been acting in good faith. Mr. Carter inclined his head and let the room decide what to do with that sentence. I watched the relatives as if they were a jury, learning that the witness they trusted was not the person they thought. This was not revenge. It was revelation. The clock ticked. The candle guttered one last time and went out with a thin curl of smoke. The pen lay between two worlds, the one that had tried to claim me, and the one that had just been set plainly in front of everyone. Sarah stepped closer to the table. She touched the corner of the deed with one finger, as if checking whether it was real. She did not look at me yet. She was not ready. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck and stared at the floor again. His eyes looked older than they had an hour before. Melissa exhaled and pulled her shoulders back. She said there must still be a path that keeps the building profitable. She said we could revisit the rent with a schedule. She said she would be reasonable if I met her halfway. Mr. Carter closed the binder halfway and rested his hand on it. He said he had additional documents to review if needed, and that he could answer questions about management transfers and notices. He said any changes to terms would need to be addressed by the owner through proper channels. He did not look at Melissa when he said, "Owner." He looked at me. The room held still. No one spoke. Even the house seemed to listen. The graphs were forgotten. The contract looked small. My children stood in the same room as me, and for the first time that night the noise of their silence ceased to hurt. It did not heal yet. It simply stopped pressing. Mr. Carter lifted his palm from the binder and waited. I breathed in, felt the air cool my chest, and let it go. I reached for nothing. I said nothing. The moment did not require me to move. It required me to let it exist.